us, let us know. You probably know various people, either get emails from me or others about topics, but let us know about any topics that you're interested in. I'm going to briefly share my screen just to remind you of who we are. We are the Cienega Watershed Partnership, and so we're the people who bring together others to talk about the culture, the history, the environment, the rangeland, the wildlife, the ecology of the Cienega Watershed here in Pima and Santa Cruz counties in southern Arizona. And with that, though, I will pass over to Shela McFarlin, who will be your master of ceremonies for today, talking about the archaeology of early agriculture in the Cienega Creek watershed.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We have decided that our presentation would be best over a long lunch and cocktails, but we will try to keep things moving because there really are three of us who each one will want to say something. But anyway, so I think those of you that know me know that I'm an archaeologist. I was also a BLM field manager, and I'm also associated with CWP. So in today's role, I'm going to be a little bit of this and that. This is an exciting project to us, and I'm really, really thrilled that you guys are tuning in. I think by the time we get to questions, you'll kind of see what we're doing here, how we're flowing, but we appreciate it. Our sponsor, BLM, funded this project, BLM in Washington, and I will talk a little bit about that later on. But I want to introduce our two speakers. Bill Gillespie there. Bill is, like myself, a retired archaeologist who isn't really retired. Bill volunteers his time and expertise on cultural resources with a number of groups here in southern Arizona and continues a lot of his projects. But Bill got his bachelor and master's degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He spent 10 years then doing field work on the Colorado Plateau with Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. He also, like myself, excavated in the Near East. Then he got a job with Coronado National Forest and went to the dark side. And so starting in 1989, he was in charge of the cultural resources there, long-term management, preservation of those incredible sites that are really scattered in Coronado. Bill retired officially at 2015 from the Forest Service, but continues his long time interest in people and the environment and the landscapes in which they live. Bill will be talking first, but I'd like to go ahead and introduce Connie. Connie is tuning in by telephone, so you will hear her voice. Connie is with Desert Archaeology. She has been a field archaeologist since 1990. Her degrees are in classical and Near Eastern archaeology from Bryn Mawr College. Her experience ranges from northeastern and southeastern United States to the Midwest to the greater Southwest. She makes excursions down here to southern Arizona and northern Arizona. She is field director for the Tempe office, where she's responsible for projects conducted in and around the Phoenix area and some of the other areas, as we just mentioned elsewhere in Arizona. Connie is really interested in locating and investigating Holcomb irrigation canals, but we weren't able to find one for this project. So fortunately, she's also interested in landscape archaeology, like Bill, people on the land and the environment. So Connie will be talking to us today about what she and her crew then located at Las Cienegas. So we're going to start with Bill, and he's going to give you the context. What is early archaeology even about? Early agriculture archaeology. So I'll turn it over to Bill, and you're going to do your own PowerPoint, correct?
Right, I'm going to hit my share screen button now. Can find the right one. Okay, let's see. I got a little thing at the top here. There we go. You see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to talk, set the stage here a little bit. little historic context about the early agricultural period and it's the importance of the Cienega Valley to it. It's for non-archaeologists, that may not be a term you're familiar with. It's a relatively new term. I stole that nice photo from the Cienega partners there. But this one is stolen from further back in time. Whoops, I missed a slide. There we go. Just a little bit of nuts and bolts about the early agricultural period. They say it's a term that archaeologists have come up with only since 1995, but it describes the last major period of the very long archaic time frame before ceramics came in. It's it doesn't get a lot of attention. It doesn't have the glamour of all the nice, lovely ruins and pottery that associate with places like Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon or Casa Grande, or anything else that's got pottery and ruins seems to attract a lot more attention. But it's an important time. It's a full millennium long or more, or even 2 millennia. It encompasses the time when agricultural cultigens show up in the Southwest and Southern Arizona and are gradually adopted into the subsistence base. People didn't automatically stop being hunters and gatherers. They were for millennia ahead of that, and they continued to rely heavily on hunting and gathering, but they also did a lot of farming, and that's something that's really changed since the 1980s. Probably in the last 30 years, the biggest changes in understanding of people's history in the Tucson or Southern Arizona have been in this early agricultural period. And that name actually came from work done in the Cienega Valley. Bruce Huckle at that time was working for the Arizona State Museum, but he investigated sites near where Maddie Canyon joins the Cienega Creek. And after he got done looking at it, he just thought calling it late archaic, which is what was the norm before then, didn't do it justice. It implies that they're just hunter-gatherers and rather simple subsistence style. And instead, there's a lot of evidence that agricultural materials, maize in particular, and squash and other things like amaranth, were a big part of what they were doing. So go back a little bit farther. Professor Emil Howry from the University of Arizona and the Arizona State Museum figured out in the 1940s that Maddie Canyon and Cienega was an interesting spot because there were very deep archaeological materials. 1950, students came out and spent a few seasons volunteering and excavating in the bottom of Maddie Wash. And all this early material they found was right at the bottom. You can see that's quite a bit of a stream bank cut there. Here's a picture. You can see a shovel for scale, and you can see all of this dark material. They're digging in a very rich organic midden there. This little pilaster that's left there, that was actually, there was a dog skeleton on top of that, a dog burial. And then they also got into some Ho-Com material, but it's right up at the top in this soil layer there. So we got literally 5 meters of fill bearing these materials. So they thought it was old, and Emil Howry called it the Early Man Project. A guy named Frank Eddy wrote this up for his thesis, and eventually was published by the State Museum or by the University of Arizona. And it opened the door for understanding there. He worked with geologists, working with all the sediments there, and worked out a chronology, but there weren't very good dates then. But in 1980, Maddie Wash and Cienega Creek flooded, and they pretty much wiped out all of Eddy's sections, and the material that we just showed that was exposed there was removed, but at the same time, it exposed a bunch of new materials and the same basic setting. This is 1983 excavation there. You can see it's a very similar thing. You got this very dark sediments down at the bottom of this 5-meter exposure. So since that time of, BC times, that we've had tremendous amount of aggradation, floodplain deposits going all the way up. And then more recently, probably starting only in the late 1800s, arroyo cutting, going back down to it again. But so Bruce Huckle was working at the State Museum at the time, and yes, I got that already, but he found a lot more stuff there and did a little bit more careful things, and found a couple of structures that are houses. And his wife, Lisa, who's a paleoethnobotanist, did something that hadn't been done before, was take flotation samples and process sediment samples, wet screening and extracting plant remains. And she found incredibly rich material, like 10,000 macrofossils coming out of 14 samples, lots and lots of organic things, 29 genera of plants, and about half of those 10,000 were fragments of maize, cupules and cob fragments and kernel fragments. So they're sitting around going, we can't call this hunter-gatherer, there's just maize everywhere. Amazing. I'm sorry. Thank you, Sheila. But so when he got around to writing it up, and he did his dissertation first, then he started working at Desert Archaeology, and decided to float this idea of early agricultural period rather than late archaic. And it kind of is cut on, especially with Desert Archaeology in particular. They embraced it immediately, but other people in Tucson have, and it's gradually expanded out into more of the Southwest. Here are the two monographs, both published by the U of A. And I highly recommend Bruce's of marshes and maize. It's a really good report, and with Lisa's report in it too. The second big input into Cienega Valley and early agricultural period was a big survey done again by, well, it's the Center for Desert Archaeology, closely associated with Desert Archaeology, Inc., and they've now changed their name to South Archaeology Southwest. But the time Bruce was working there and finishing and getting his report published, student Michelle Stevens organized and directed a very large survey with using volunteer labor, both dedicated avocationalists and professional archaeologists. And they surveyed a bunch along the lower Cienega in the Pantano area, and then a big chunk up in the basin where Empire Ranch, and mostly in what is now BLM land. And they started when Bruce was doing that. That was still a ranch, and actually it was owned by Animax when he did that 1980s work. But they surveyed a total of like 42 square miles and 422 sites, and 50 of them with components to the early ag period. And Michelle's focus was definitely the early ag. She wrote her dissertation. It was all about archaic and early agricultural period. And so look at the major components of the early ag period now. As it's known, there are two big phases, San Pedro and Cienega. Bruce Huckle, again, was one that after his work there, he recognized that there were a lot of these little points with deep notches that he applied the name Cienega. They've been kicking around the Southwest before. San Pedro was already established. And then after Michelle's survey, she and Jane Sleva, who's a projectile point specialist in desert archaeology, got together and looked through things they'd collected and recognized another new point they called the Empire Point. And about the same time, things were really jumping off the scales in Tucson, where before there was very little of the late archaic, early agricultural known, but especially with development of I-10 and archaeologists, again, a lot from desert archaeology, started doing big projects, cultural resource management, and getting down to these same layers and finding a huge amount of evidence of big sites of the early agricultural period, both the San Pedro phase and the Cienega. But you can see those two, one of the two phases is named for the Cienega area, and two of the three projectile points, the main projectile points from that time are coming from the Cienega. So it's played a major role. Just one little snapshot from one of those huge projects, and the biggest site is Las Capas, which, a little ironically, it's at the mouth of what should be the Cienega. If you didn't change the name to Pantano and Rito as it goes on down to the Santa Cruz. But this is a big site where they found large fields and irrigation ditches that are coming off mainly the Santa Cruz, but it's right below where the Cienega Rincon and Rito and Cañada de Oro flow in. So they went out and outlined with white paint the little berms that marked out field plots and ditches. If you look really closely, there are little tiny people there that are excavating pit houses. So this is a big deposit of alternating fields and houses now and then. A lot of from the early San Pedro and Empire points. There were more Empire points here than anywhere else. But it all started up there in the Cienega. Michelle's work was finally published in 2013. I was looking through and saw this nice little quote that, given the passage of 2 decades, now can make it 3 now, since the field work, there's even this known inventory is in need of reassessment regarding current site conditions. And so that's the kind of the motivation for this project that Connie's going to talk about now. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Connie.
Okay. I need to share my screen. Oh.
And can you hear me?
Yeah, let me start the screen share here of your show. There's your show, except I need to go back to slide number 1. Okay, is everybody seeing that?
I can also see like all the edge screen.
Oh, sorry. Start
might be able to do
slideshow. Slideshow
It might
from
just be easier
beginning.
for people. There we go.
Yeah. So whenever you want a next slide, tell me and I'll try it.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
And you can hear me then. That sounds good.
We can hear you. So take it away, Connie. What
All
happened
right.
next?
All right. Well, lunchtime is short, so I'm going to jump right in. This spring, Desert Archaeology set out with a list of sites found by the Cienega Valley Survey that Bill was just talking about. And from the hundreds of sites found by that survey, the BLM had selected a random sample of 25 sites with a recorded or suspected early agricultural component for us to relocate. Since the original survey took place nearly 30 years ago, the goal of the survey was to relocate a minimum of at least 20 of these sites and assess their current condition and identify any threats to their preservation. The larger purpose was to provide information that could help protect all of the sites in the conservation area. In total, an attempt was made to relocate 26 sites. Desert added a 26th site because it was a really close neighbor to one of the sample sites, and there was already a standing suggestion that the sites were in fact one really large site, and we'll see those sites later. In the end, we relocated 23 sites shown on this map. Most of the sites are located pretty close to Cienega Creek or along major drainages leading to the creek. And for reference, you can see Empire Ranch is located on the left or west side of the map. And if you know the conservation area, the road up from the southern entrance would come from the bottom center of the map. Overall, we found most sites were within 100 meters of their reported location, but rarely were sites exactly where they were supposed to be. Most sites were found in decent condition with only a few suffering from really serious threats, but not surprisingly, most of the sites have been impacted in some way. In most cases, we found sites to be larger than reported, and we did find additional features and artifact types at several sites. There were only 3 sites that we didn't relocate for various reasons, but there were no indications that the sites had been destroyed. So in the right conditions, all those other 3 sites should be findable. You got, next slide, you had it. There you
Ah,
go. You almost, I paused too dramatically right there.
yeah.
These photos are just to give you an overview of the area and an idea of what the sites looked like this spring. The first obstacle to finding most of the sites was grass, lots and lots of grass. While vegetation was pretty much universally thick on most sites, it was not really a hindrance to finding the site. As you can see in the foreground, you can see the ground at your feet pretty well, but your overall field of vision has a pretty small radius, and it does hinder what you can see overall. These would be terrible conditions for launching a survey to find new sites, but it was okay for relocating known sites. The photo in the lower right is one of the southernmost sites, a scatter of flake stone located on a ridge overlooking the watershed. And the photo on the left is on high ground, but lower in the drainage. So you can see a greater mix of vegetation and dense vegetation and mesquite growing in the distant lower lying areas. In the left-hand photo, Chris is recording a large rock pile area that you really can't see. Vegetation really does make features like rock piles hard to distinguish from natural rock on the landscape. So even though we could find sites in the grass, we often could not relocate all the features and artifacts reported at a site. Next slide, please. Once sites were relocated, we inspected the site to see how it compared to the original record and to assess its current condition. Overall, we found most sites to be in decent condition, but the main threats we identified repeatedly were erosion, cattle traffic, and modern human disturbances like roads and unofficial campsites. These are the sort of impacts we want to draw attention to for each site, so the source of the damage can be addressed in the future. In all of the examples shown here, artifacts have been exposed or scattered by disturbances. Next slide, please. To take you through the relocation process with at least one site and show you a site suffering from severe erosion, I thought I would show you EE2186. This is a site in the Cienega Valley survey. The Cienega Valley survey reported as a artifact scatter eroding out of the banks of Cienega Creek. It is a buried site with artifacts only found in eroded areas and nothing visible. Oh, still back one.
Oh, sorry.
So it's only, but there's nothing visible on the intact ground surface. It's only shown in eroded areas. Some of the artifacts belong to an early to late Rincon phase ceramic component exposed here. This slide shows you two of the types of maps that the CVS filed with their site cards. The upper left is a sketch map, and the right is the same site plotted on a USGS quad. The center map shows how these boundaries fall on a USGS map of the era of 1996. While you can't really tell from the right-hand copy, you can tell from the sketch map that they used the USGS map as a base for their sketch. Since the CVS only had a handful of personal GPS units on survey, the survey report states that they used topographic maps to plot their location by hand. And we found during relocation that sites plotted on distinctive landforms, knolls, the end of ridges, etc., were the most accurate. Sites where a GPS was used could be off by 100 meters. In this particular case, both cases could be true. The site is located in a very convoluted area between two drainages, but I think they found artifacts in an eroded area near the tip of the landform and then plotted the site where you can see an eroded divot on the USGS map, which is fine, but the site is actually about 100 meters south of that point. The red outline is where we eventually found the site. Next slide, please. Of course, when we start looking for a site, we have to begin by inspecting the reported location. But nowadays we have access to a variety of maps in Google Earth, and we are always comparing what we have found with what was reported. And aerial maps like this are a great help. This slide shows an aerial view of the site, and you can see the light colored eroded area is where we found the site compared to the more densely vegetated area where the site was reported. This eroded area matches the narrative description on the site card. Next slide, please. These photos show what some of that erosion looks like on the ground. It's pretty severe. Both of these photos were taken near the site, but the one on the right was actually taken at the northern edge of the site boundary. Next slide, please. This is the site as we mapped it this spring. We found artifacts throughout the area, but most of the artifacts and features were exposed in the south. Importantly, no features were previously recorded at this site, but we found 3 features exposed in the southern area. Next slide, please. This photo shows that southern portion of the site. With one of our crews standing in the background, you can kind of see that there's over 1 meter or 4 to 5 feet of sediment that has washed away from this area. Chris is recording a feature exposed in the cut bank, but the rest of the features we recorded were found deflated on the exposed surface in the foreground. Next slide, please. On the left is the feature that Chris was recording in that cut bank. You can see the flat slabs of stone highlighted in the profile. We did not dare clean the profile to examine the feature more closely, but it looks like a slab-lined pit. On the right is the deflated remains of what could be a similar feature. You can just see the outline of slab fragments and around a slightly clearer center. Both of these, I mean, the one on the left is of course in more imminent danger than the one on the right. Next slide, please. The third and last feature we noted on site was the deflated remains of a prehistoric trash deposit. It could either have been a trash-filled pit of some kind, or it could have been a trash mound. Either way, what remains is the heavier artifacts and gravels that have not yet washed away. There are some natural gravel bars in this area, but this low mound was covered with artifacts. And the photo on the right shows a close-up of the feature's surface artifacts, and most of those are small eroded sherds. All the little red arrows are pointing little artifacts. Because all 3 of these exposed features are in danger of washing away, this is a case where we recommended that some level of data recovery could be used to document these features more thoroughly. This would apply to the artifact scatter exposed around the features as well. Perhaps some level of in-field analysis. Drone photography might be used to help document the site, but it also could keep an eye on the progression of erosion here. Next slide, please. Finally, because this site is only known by the artifacts and features that have been exposed by erosion, we do not know the full extent of the site. Looking at the figure that shows the shaded topography on the right, you can see the eroding edges of the site, but you can also see how much of the floodplain terrace remains intact. These photos also show how the site is located where Wood Canyon drainage on the right meets Cienega Creek on the left. This would have been a prime spot for a site. So it is perfectly possible that this site could be quite substantial, especially given what has eroded out thus far. Next slide. With the following sites, I'm going to try to speed things up a bit by really only showing you what we have found and not how we found it. This site is similar to the previous site in that it also has a buried component, but it is capped with some flood sediments and a ceramic period component. However, like the last site, erosion is exposing the older deposits around the edges of the drainage to the south and west. These are the 2 sites where it was suggested that they might be one site, EE 261 and 266. Interestingly, the smaller, lower 261 in the south was recorded as a middle archaic San Pedro and Cienega phase early agricultural site, and the larger, higher 266 was recorded as an early to middle Rincon phase site. But from what we could see in the field along the western edge of 266, it seems older buried deposits were eroding out there as well. In other words, we again don't know the full extent of the older buried deposits here. So these sites should be considered one site, especially because the existing boundaries were based on surface artifacts. And even then the gap between sites was minimal. Taken together, the 2 sites cover nearly 100 acres.
Oh.
As you can see in the figure, the site has had a variety of impacts because it is so large. But it is erosion that's probably, again, the most worrisome here. You'll note up in the north, there's some drainage down cutting, and in the southwest, erosion is exposing a lot of artifacts. Next slide, please. This shows the cut bank in the north end of the site. We didn't see any artifacts exposed here in the cut, but this photo shows an old ground surface buried by more recent flood sediment. The gray color comes from the buildup of organic material on a long stable surface, and then it's been buried by a layer of coarse flood sediment. That's, you don't know how old that is until you can examine what's in the gray. Next slide, please. This is some of the erosion we saw in the southwest. Small gullies like this were commonly where we saw artifacts here. The gully on the right may have started life as a cattle trail. Like the previous site, monitoring erosion and documenting what is exposed by erosion was one of the recommendations we made for this site. Next slide, please. This next site is different from the others I've shown you. EE2274 is a small site set just above the Cienega Creek floodplain that may have both an early agricultural component and a proto-historic component. The site was covered with a lot of grass, but the area has a small, dense concentration of artifacts, including a good amount of groundstone and enough fire-cracked rock to suggest roasting features are present on site. There is also a lot of early stage flakestone debris. The Cienega Valley survey collected a point they identified as a Cortero, but then wondered if it could be Civipery. They also mentioned finding 2 sherds that could be Civipery as well. Next slide, please. During the site tour with the Heritage Technical team, Bill Gillespie found the small point on the right, which is more complete and more delicate than the original point collected by the CVS. The photo on the left shows some of the large lithic debris found on site. Next slide, please. The point Bill found was not far from a grinding area we identified on site, an area where it appeared there was a central nether stone set amongst an assemblage of monos and other cobbles. This didn't look like a cache of groundstone, but more like an abandoned work area. With the possible Civipery ceramics and Bill's point, it seems possible that some of the cobbles seen here could outline proto-historic structures. Unfortunately, the grass cover on the site seems to be hiding a lot of the site's potential. But because the site does seem to be harboring a largely uninvestigated proto-historic component, we recommended this site be prioritized for protection and some further investigation. The site is located just off the road and near the creek with potentially delicate surface features. The site is particularly sensitive to surface disturbances. One weekend of unauthorized camping here could do some serious damage. Next slide, please. This is EE2290. This site is located not far from the last, and it was the most dramatic example of a site being exactly where it should be, but being not at all as it was reported. The site is located on a very distinct knoll overlooking the creek, so the Cienega Valley survey plot falls dead center. Next slide, please. But the site was reported to be a 100-meter diameter scatter of flakestone and ceramics surrounding a single rock pile or a fire pit. The ceramics had the scatter had an early agricultural component and a tanky vertiphase ceramic component. However, when we started to look for the one rock pile, we found several rock piles, and we also started to notice a good amount of groundstone on site. In the end, we located 8 rock pile features, dozens of mono and matate fragments, and 3 pieces of shaped turquoise. Next slide, please. The site pretty much extends to all of the habitable surfaces on this knoll and is closer to 300 meters in diameter. The site serves to illustrate the value of revisiting sites. Given the difference between the original record and what we found, I can only assume that the original surveyors had terrible ground surface visibility, which if you think back to the grass covering the last site we just looked at, grass can seriously hinder your ability to detect anything. As you can see in the photograph, we actually had pretty good surface visibility at this site. Next slide, please. This is the last site we're going to look at. It is EE276, and it serves as the most prominent example of a site impacted by modern intrusions. amongst the sites we revisited. 276 is a probable archaic site strung along the edge of Cienega Creek floodplain, but the site is also strung out along the watershed's main access road, and there's another road that crosses the north end of the site. This northern road in particular seems to have developed into an unofficial campground with a number of pull-offs. But aside from these activities, there is also a prominent livestock corridor that runs north-south through the site along the fence line. Next slide, please. This is an aerial view of the cattle trails on site. The corridor is pretty distinct, but there are other cattle trails that range throughout the site as well. It's kind of a sorry conclusion to end on a view of cattle trails, but addressing the issues that are impacting this site could make a good case study for how to treat these issues at sites threatened by similar impacts, which was part of the goal for this work. And it's a good segue to hand it back to Sheila, who was going to talk about preservation goals in the watershed.
Okay. I think I am. Stop share. Now I need to find another little right here. Okay. Oops. Everybody seeing this okay? So I'm going to pull it together in a little bit of a different way, and then we're going to allow you to ask all kinds of questions. But my section is going to focus on evaluation and management considerations, which is maybe more difficult than actually relocating these sites. The people you see there, including Connie and Bill, is our heritage technical team. Las Cienegas, you'll hear a lot about the heritage technical team, but this is a volunteer, professional, and some interested avocational folks, and we advise BLM on cultural resource issues. We've been in business since about 2010. There's also an upland team, a landscape team, and a riparian team. So 4 teams help advise BLM on how to manage Las Cienegas. So you're going to be hearing a little bit about that heritage technical team. So let's start with, why did we get the funding for this project, which is kind of interesting. The Las Cienegas was designated in 2000. It became BLM property in 1988. So BLM has been managing it since 1988. Some of the questions that have come up in about the 20th anniversary of Las Cienegas is, well, you know, how is this doing? How are the sites doing? How's the landscape doing? And we were talking about this from the standpoint of cultural resources. A grant became available from the Washington office. So basically, we applied for it. This grant required 2 things. Overall, it was a management-driven research with citizen-supported studies. So we had to have on-the-ground research which would inform a pertinent and pressing management question. And I think you've seen what those are. So we proposed to use a sample of the early agricultural sites to produce a tool for BLM to use in making some management decisions. It also required citizen-supported studies, research that engages citizen as assistance in data collection, compilation, or data analysis. What we proposed then was to engage and seek input from the technical and public representation from established groups with deep public interest in the Cienegas heritage resources. And that's mainly the heritage technical team. But we also had some conversations with folks from Pima County who manage the Cienega Natural Preserve, from our site stewards, and some other folks to get input as well. We did not do a specific Native American consultation on the ground, but BLM did contact a number of tribes and let them know what we were doing and to seek their input. So the question is, or what is the site conditions and what management recommendations resulted? So the idea was, of course, to present this to BLM archaeologists and managers. An interesting thing happened this spring all the pertinent BLM archaeologists and all the pertinent managers left or retired or found new work. So we are dealing with a brand new group of people coming in. So what we'll be trying to do is to present this to them. So because they're the ones who really do have the decision-making and future management. But you saw a lot about the site conditions. One of the things we're trying to do for the watershed as a whole and for Las Cienegas is to determine, do a trend analysis for archaeological sites, wildlife, vegetation, erosion, water, and to determine what those trends are. Because there's a lot of human impacts out there. There's a lot of climate impacts out there. We were trying to measure these. So one measurement we have selected is how are the site conditions. So monitoring recommendations, you have heard that word mentioned and you're familiar with it already. So some specific monitoring recommendations or some specific features to be monitored then will be included in our results here, along with site protection. Do we close a trail? Do we rebury a feature? Do we move a cattle tree? What do we do? And then finally, there may be some other management actions. We may want to consult with some folks on the protohistoric side, partner with a university to get some of this work done. So a lot of this then we'll present to BLM and partner with them. So what happens next? Okay, the management at Las Cienegas can be kind of complicated to people who haven't participated in it, but BLM developed an approved management plan that was approved in 2003. And I mentioned to you, it set up these 4 technical teams. For the past few years, twice a year, the teams have gone out on the ground doing what's called biological planning. Literally, the range people, the archaeologists, the wildlife people, the managers go out to certain locations and kick around the dirt and talk about what's going to happen. So I kind of want to lay out for you here, what is the future of this information? How are we going to take the information, provide the context that Bill has, the specifics that Connie has, and where do those go to get to decisions for management? So the first thing that's going to happen is Connie is going to finish her professional report, the final site forms, the GIS materials, and they'll be sent to CWP, to myself, to the Heritage Technical Team, Bill, and to BLM. And we'll figure out who that is in BLM right now. Then the Heritage Technical Team members and CWP, we will put together a 1-page draft set of recommendations to go to BLM to say, here are the sites and here's what we think ought to happen for management. So that's your citizen input, if you will, part professional, part citizen. Then we actually sit down with BLM. That might be in August, given what the schedules look like. BLM may choose to implement some things right away, like try to patrol maybe an area where people are illegally parking RVs and sign it or patrol it. There are some things that you could do pretty fast. Then in likely September, there is the annual state of the watershed. And this is where we do assess the conditions at Las Cienegas and the Cienega watershed. And there is a section there. We always spend time with cultural resources. And so we'll be looking at the county, the Forest Service, and Las Cienegas, and pull together folks who will all be reporting on site condition. And this is really interesting, of course, because the Cienega Preserve, Pima County, has also been relocating sites at the same time we have. So we have a good comparative basis. Then basically in the fall, November 17th and 18th, and you are more than welcome to participate, is when we will have the annual biological planning workshop and field day. So we will actually talk about this report again with about 45 to 50 people. And then we go out and literally kick dirt, although I don't know if we want to take 45 to 50 people on some of the archaeological sites. We'll have to figure out how we visit that. So based on all of those steps and stages, that's how we will continually to work the data and then to get it into the hands of the decision makers and the managers. Now, with that, Tom, I will turn it back to you if you have questions that people want answered. And you can handle it however you want, starting with the technical to the general or whatever.
Sure. Are there questions from our audience?
Okay, well, we go home then.
So I guess, you know, one question I have is sort of what does the team, I guess, see as the biggest threats to the, I mean, you've gone over some of this, but the viability and the robustness of the archaeological sites in the watershed going forward?
Connie, do you want to address that first?
Can you repeat the question?
So I guess what do you see as the biggest threats going forward to the integrity of these archaeological sites?
I think it's probably a combination of the three things I mentioned. I was actually surprised that the human impacts were not as great as I expected. So maybe erosion. I mean, erosion is a harder one to control, and it you know, since so many of these sites are along waterways, I mean, the impacts there are great, especially the down cutting.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll just note that the BLM has right now a well, I think the comment period has just ended on an environmental assessment to do erosion control in a number of places at Las Cienegas and surrounding area, including some county land. I think there's an opportunity here for them to consider when they do it, the positive impacts of doing that restoration work on some of these sites. And what we've learned generally about some of the washes and head cuts is if you want to resolve them, go way upstream and start managing the problem there. So I think that would probably benefit some archaeological sites. Bill?
Yep, I'd add my opinion too, that erosion is still the #1 thing. I think things have calmed down quite a bit since the 1980s, but the potential's still there. One thing Connie showed, that site 186, that's really close to the Matty Wash sites that I showed those dramatic photos of. It's just so dynamic. One thing I didn't mention, when Bruce Suckle and his team were there at that Los Ojitos site in the summer of 1983, the end of the summer, there was a flood and it exposed like another 60 meters of prehistoric midden deposits that they hadn't, wasn't exposed when they were doing their work. They're a little excited about that, but then in October of '83 had the big rain event and it all got covered up. So it didn't get eroded away, but it's well buried now. It's just a matter of months that things can switch one way or the other.
Sure. Okay. I see a hand up from Alan Dart. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Alan, if you want.
Yeah, could you tell us what the status is of Native American consultations at this point?
Basically, they were begun when Kim Ryan was there, and she started last fall of notifying tribes and discussing their interests specifically. She has all of the, of course, the documentation and the telephone records, but we were not involved in that since that's government to government. And I cannot tell you much more than what she told us, which is none of the tribes decided to come back out in the field in association with this project. What typically happens with Tucson BLM is they meet quarterly with the Southern tribes, and they may in fact want to present some of this information and then see where the tribes want to go with it. That's really all I can tell you, Al.
Okay. And there's a question in the chat from Elizabeth Butler. What was the size of the Desert Archaeology survey team and how long did they spend in the field?
There were 3 of us and we were out there for 2 weeks. So 8 10-hour days to do 26, to look for 26 sites.
It looks like the next question is from down east, from Robin.
Up east, up east.
That too, both. So my question is that in looking at one of Connie's first slides, we saw that many of the sites that she was investigating were close to washes or streams or wetland areas. I'm interested to find out if there were other sites that were further away from what we define now as wetter environments. Just in thinking about whether or not we are only seeing things that emerge from erosion systems, or are there really other sites that are further away that may indicate that the landscape water patterns might have been different at different times?
Yeah, I guess to paraphrase there, right, is the advent of agriculture in this area and in this watershed an artifact of a particular climate period? And was it wetter or drier? I assume it was wetter based on what you all were showing, but.
Well, we're dealing with non-irrigated agriculture. And
Okay.
that means it's dependent. Okay, Bill, I'm first and you're second. Mainly we're dealing with, but so we're looking at floodplains and other areas which would have had a certain amount of moisture there to support, maize and other cultigens. So mainly they are tied to that kind of environmental possibility unless they irrigate. So Bill?
I would just add that I think it was maybe not overall necessarily wetter, but the conditions were good with water tables high and close there, and they were probably doing some relatively easy to get to wet spots that they could do it, and then it degraded and you didn't see that so much. But that was part of Michelle's goal, was to see the distribution of the early agricultural sites, and she did find, they found several that were exposed along the stream, but most of the rest were on terraces near the streams. But there are some that are getting further away, 1 kilometer or 2. And she also incorporated some other work, like Bruce Huckle had just come off working at in the Animax Rosemont area, where he excavated 10 archaic and early to late archaic sites up in the upper Bajada and in the foothills and the higher elevation. So put it all together, they're still spread across the landscape. And Al's familiar with that from the Tucson area. You start in the early ag period, you started getting more concentration along the wet spots, along the drainages, but there's still a foraging strategy that's going up to the tops of the Bajadas and probably into a lot of places.
The other thing to keep in mind, oh, sorry. I was going to say the other thing to keep in mind is that we were looking at the Cienega Valley survey site, which didn't always go up into a lot of the high country. So there are a lot of archaeological sites, and a lot of the high flat ridges might have been good for just dry farming for a lot of other things as well.
Yeah.
One of the other dialogues that we're having, and I seek comments from anybody here, is next steps archaeologically speaking. You know, do we try to enlarge the sample of 25 to look at 25 more agricultural sites? Or do we try to get more research funds then to look at other non-agricultural sites to see how they're doing? Do we go into a testing phase? You know, what are the next steps beyond managing the sites, which of course is what BLM is faced with? What do we do with now that we've learned what we've learned?
Yeah.
I'll
Hey, any
chime
other-
in.
Oh, go ahead, Robin.
So where do you think BLM is going to want to take this? Sheila, Connie, Bill?
BLM may look at it from the standpoint of projects and future work related to recreational development out there. They may look at it with regard to some projects, they're going erosion projects to try to figure out, again, you know, looking at it from a Section 106 standpoint, where do they have to look at because of what we now know is going on? They may look at it that way. It is harder to look at just the the general management and moving forward unless some action is tied to it. It's harder for them to do it. That would be my guess.
Well, if there are no further questions, let's thank Sheila, Bill, and Connie for a nice presentation. And everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank
And
you.
we'll still take your ideas and questions when you've got them.
Yeah. So, yeah, and just to not scare you, Connie, but there were 30 people here, so.
Oh,
30 people. Oh, Connie, there were only 9. He's just kidding.
now you tell me. You told me nobody was listening.
They came. I think they had fun. So, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.